And as you all know, the question today is no longer if Ambazonians support or won a referendum conducted to end this 7 years conflict in the territory. The question is, what kind of referendum? What kind of referendum are they looking for? And how do they get there? How do they achieve it? Should that referendum be conducted by Cameroon, or by the United Nations, or by Ambazonians? These are the different scenarios that all different people are articulating out there. And they are right to do so, because when we look at the past examples in countries where referendums have been conducted, we realize that in some cases, the people agitating, asking for independence, actually conducted the referendum. The case of Eritrea is a good one, for example. You also have the South Sudan as another example. We have so many of these cases. So the question and the debate has been, who conducts this referendum as far as the case of Ambazonia is concerned? Joining me tonight, somebody that you know so well, whom I call a true friend of Ambazonia. Ambassador Tibor Nagy has been in the forefront advocating for a free and independent Southern Cameroons, Ambazonia, since he retired from his diplomatic work under the presidency of President Trump. Ambassador Nagy, it's a pleasure to have you back joining me here, sir. Good evening.
Is the sound okay?
The sound is great. It just seems that you are a little bit frozen intermittently.
Okay, very good. All right, so I would like to just make one addendum. I have not been advocating for a referendum. My advocation has always been for the rights and dignity of Southern Cameroonians and Ambazonians. The mechanism there is absolutely up to the community. I don't believe it should be any foreigners, who would be advocating for that. But if the feeling is for a referendum, then as you said, there are many, many examples in history.
Right. There are quite many, and let me take you to a number here that you probably are very much aware of, and I am here referring to the examples in the Eritrea, the examples in the Sudan. Let me look at East Timor, for example. Let me read this. The East Timor referendum was a historic event that took place in 1999, in which the people of East Timor were given the opportunity to vote on their future political status. East Timor, a former Portuguese colony, was occupied by Indonesia in 1975 and was ruled by Indonesia as a province until 1999. The referendum was proposed by the United Nations. Now, I like the emphasis here on the referendum was proposed by the United Nations, and its purpose was to determine whether the people of East Timor wanted to remain a part of Indonesia or as an autonomous province or become an independent nation. That is with the case of East Timor. Let's look at South Sudan. It said the South Sudan referendum was a historic event that took place in 2011. South Sudan was semi-autonomous region of Sudan until 2011, when it became the world's newest independent country. Now he adds, the referendum was the result of a 2005 peace agreement that ended decades of civil war between the Sudanese government and the Sudan People's Liberation Army, which represented the people of South Sudan. Ambassador, the question that I want to ask from this is this. East Timor the United Nations proposed a referendum. For the case of South Sudan, a referendum came as a result of a peace agreement reached in 2005. Where do you place Ambazonia between these two?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let's talk about just the principles behind these types of events. Because, first of all, there is a principle under international law that all people have the right of self-determination. And that's contained in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of the United Nations. And then, of course, I think we all know about the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I believe all United Nations members ascribe to that. So then, when you have a group of people who would like to have their self-determination, and they're part of another territory, referendums would usually come after a successful political or military struggle, and pressure from the separatists, as we call them, or nationalist organizations will then force either the international community to advocate for a referendum, or actually, as you mentioned, Chris, a negotiation with the country that is actually controlling the territory. The cases you mentioned, they both, I think, have relevance to the case of Ambazonia. The one that I would also point you to is the case of Bougainville, which is a territory of Papua New Guinea. And that, I think, would be one that would be fairly close to the case of Ambazonia, because they've had a civil struggle. There was a peace agreement between Bougainville and the government of Papua New Guinea. Then they did have the required referendum in 2020, and 97% of the people voted for independence. And now they're in the process of trying to make that actually happen. So each of these situations is very unique, but there are a lot of factors that are very similar that go into all of these.
So, if I get your idea, because if you look at the case of Namibia, for instance, Namibia's case is quite, it came from the United Nations essentially, I guess, through advocacy. The United Nations actually secured a referendum for Namibia. Let me look at that. The Namibian referendum was a historic event that took place in 1990. The referendum was proposed by the United Nations, and its purpose was to determine whether the people of Namibia wanted to remain under South African control or become an independent nation. The vote was held on March 21, 1990, and the overwhelming majority of Namibians voted for independence. So the key word here, Ambassador, is the United Nations propose. Would that not be a good route for Ambazonia, which means Ambazonians then maybe get some godfathers who can go after the United Nations, maybe lobby the United Nations to make that proposal, considering that we have been fighting for close to 7 years now. The Republic of Cameroon rejects dialogue. The Republic of Cameroon thinks that they can kill everybody to submission. So, in the case of Ambazonia, wouldn't there be the need for the United Nations to propose such a referendum?
The key word, I actually agree with you, absolutely, is united. That is one of the reasons that I have been so adamant in encouraging the community to be united in its point of view, because to get to the point that you are mentioning right now, it is so critical for the community to advocate to the United Nations and to allies around the world, and yes, even to the government at Yaoundé, what the community wants. because I guarantee you that the government in Yaoundé would pay attention much more if the Southern Cameroonian community comes to them with a united voice. And it goes to the United Nations with a united voice. And it goes to the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and Germany and the European Union with a united voice. That is why that is the first critical element, because before the community can take step one, it has to speak with a united voice.
We agree on that, but in the situation where you do not have a united voice, but you have the people who really need a closure to the conflict on the ground. I'm referring to the people on the ground who overwhelmingly say, you know what, we don't have to have our people being killed on a daily basis. We want a referendum. Doesn't that speak volumes? Because I guess when you talk about division, you are essentially talking about the leadership, this leadership or the leadership in the diaspora. When it comes to a referendum, it is no longer the diaspora that has the final say. It should be the people. And if the people say, we want a referendum, shouldn't that matter the most?
Absolutely, that should matter the most. But then, Chris, you get to the question, how is the voice of the people on the ground sent around the world? Right now, we look around at the situation, and the voice of the people on the ground is actually the voice that is in the diaspora. Because those are the people that show up in the offices in New York. Those are the people that show up in the offices of the State Department. And, they're the ones that have a lot of these media outlets. So that's the voice that the international community is hearing. These other cases that we've talked about, whether it's South Sudan, whether it's Eritrea, case of Bougainville, East Timor, there was absolutely no question as to what the people really wanted. And that has been one of the detractions of the case of Ambazonia, Southern Cameroons, is that there has been a mixed message which has been sent around the world. And that is what has to change if the community is going to succeed.
From your personal assessment, what do you think are the chances? Let me put it this way. From your own personal assessment, what do you see the chances for a United Nations supervised referendum in Ambazonia?
Personally, I think the chances would be very good if
the people are saying this is what we want, or we want to see this happen.
If the people are saying that with one voice, and that is the voice that is heard by the entire international community, and if the point that is made is that under the current situation, the people of Ambazonia do not have their full rights, privileges, and dignity as prescribed by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then their chances would be good. But again, I get back to the point that everybody does pay attention to who is the messenger. So, the voice has to be one voice asking for this. And that is when the voyage begins.
What about this other perspective, the idea that Cameroon will not negotiate? They just think that they will kill their way to victory. And I think you've been one of those out there who have said there is no military solution to this conflict. So that alone, the fact that Cameroon will not want to negotiate, shouldn't that be an incentive for the United Nations to say, we can end this thing by just calling the people and telling them, go and vote. Let's see where you want to belong. That's what they did in Namibia.
Yeah, but remember also that Namibia, East Timor, South Sudan, they went through a very long and extremely nasty civil war before it got to that point. The key selling point to the United Nations, to allied capitals, is the fact that the people of Southern Cameroon right now are not receiving their human rights and their human dignity under their current situation. Because if it's just a matter, for example, if it's just a matter that they're not happy with the current, arrangements, but if they had the full privileges and the equality that everybody else in Cameroon had, then it would not be a very sympathetic reception. But we all know how terrible the situation is in Southern Cameroons. So that is the point that needs to be sold by the community to the international audience, because that is the pole that you put your hat on.
Now, talking about that, many people have taken offense when they hear you say, hey, stop talking about this history. Stop going back. Stop looking at the behind mirrors. Begin to look from your windscreen. If you can explain a little of that, let people understand what you mean, because I think some people have really taken offense for that. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I'm sorry if people take offense, but as I've said over and over again, I deal with reality, not with fantasy. And, we can all imagine, you and I, how we would like the ideal world to be, but we live in this world. Some people will say it's a fallen world, and, we have to deal with that. So we can have any number of conferences, and we can have brilliant academicians, because God knows the community has some brilliant academicians, give lectures on United Nations Resolution 1608 and what happened and what year and how terrible it was. But it's not going to matter one iota in the reality of this world and in moving forward. So whether or not I offend people, I'm just telling you that's the way it is. If you want someone to come in here and paint a beautiful picture and talk about unicorns and rainbows, then I'm not the right person to do that, because I'm going to tell the truth, and I'm going to describe this awful world the way it is and how you can make progress in this current world.
I guess the question then is, I not totally understand where you are coming from. I don't think I'm trying to put you here on the spot, because I get your point absolutely 200%. But for the benefit of those who just do not understand how you can stop talking about 1608 and all the articles 1961 and think that you can gain independence. So what should they be talking about precisely?
Well, here's my question to all the wonderful, dedicated, sincere people who put everything on Resolution 1608. I asked them, so how will that be implemented? How will that matter to the future of Ambazonia? How will that be translated from the paper into actuality and reality? And I have yet to hear an answer from anybody, because they have this magical thinking that somehow somebody's going to snap their finger and the international community is going to magically make the army of the Republic disappear from Ambazonia, and they will turn over the keys to the kingdom to the Ambazonian people. And if that's what they're waiting for, then hopefully they will live to be 200 or 300 years old.
Now, we have also heard this argument between, it should not be a referendum, it ought to be a plebiscite. What difference would you give between the two?
I think that there's historical differences, and the problem with plebiscite is that I believe, and I'm not a legal expert, and I know in the community you have many legal experts, but I believe that there's a very different connotation in the English language and tradition and the French language and tradition between what a plebiscite is. In modern English and in modern political theory, plebiscite is not seen as something positive, it's seen as something negative, whereas a referendum offers more choices and is viewed much more positively. That's why if you search you have the number of referendums that you mentioned, but plebiscites not so much. But again, we're talking about terminologies, and I've said before, if there's a mechanism that will get the people of Ambazonia their rights, privileges, and dignity, I don't care what you call it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that is it. I've made a monologue here, in which I stated, hey, if you are making a journey in the car, and the car gets into an accident, and firefighters show up, and they cannot open you the door to go out, but they can open the window, but you stay in there and say, you must open the door. I can only go out by the door. You may die in there even before they open it. That is, even if they can open it. So, totally agree. But, Ambassador, one thing that troubles Ambazonians is who conducts this referendum? That is, assuming there will be one. Who conducts it? Who should be in charge? Is it the people of Ambazonia, like in the case of, I think, South Sudan, because they already had a semi-autonomous government, or should it be the United Nations or the government of La République du Cameroon?
See, that is an excellent question, and you mentioned a number of examples. And again, if you look at the referendums, whether it's Quebec, whether it's Scotland, on and on and on, they're all different, and that has to be agreed in the negotiations preceding the referendum. Because obviously, I'm assuming that the people of Southern Cameroon would have certain suspicions if the referendum was to be conducted by the government in Yaoundé.
Correct.
So Eritrea had a provisional administration already in place, and the Ethiopians and the Eritreans both agreed that it could be conducted by the Eritreans themselves. Correct. And there were observers.
Because there was already a kind of an arrangement between them,
Yeah.
A peace truce.
Yes, and in South Sudan, again, there was a administration, and there was an international observing mission. The Carter Center was there. Jimmy
Right.
Carter himself was there. And when you had 80% of the people turn out, and it was 99% in favor of independence, I don't think that that's a question. I mean, here, practical questions are very important. Who conducts a referendum? Who gets to participate in the referendum? Is there going to be a census taken just before the referendum? What exactly are the questions that go on the referendum? And the how the questions are worded is extremely, extremely important.
Yeah.
And then there has to be an understanding ahead of time that everybody will accept, the conclusions of the referendum. And how will the decision of the referendum be implemented? In South Sudan, for example, after the Civil War, there was a period of time that the South Sudan was given a certain amount of autonomy within the Sudanese Federation, and then they had the referendum. Or do you have the referendum and then have a little period of time? So all of these are extremely, extremely important questions that have to be agreed to, and this is where the unity of your community is so important, because people have to agree. If they're going to negotiate with the government in Yaoundé and say the United Nations, they have to have one set of talking points. You can't have a delegation where you have some people say, oh, these are the questions. No, these are the questions. You know how ridiculous that looks.
Right. In the case of Namibia, we learned that after the referendum, negotiations were held. That is, after the referendum, negotiations were held between the South African government and the Namibian political parties, which resulted in the implementation of the transitional government and the drafting of a new constitution. So, in the case of Ambazonia, what about the situation? Of course, you don't have any control over this, but these are just conjectures. In the case of Ambazonia, how about a situation where the United Nations come in and say, all right, we think that the people of Ambazonia want to vote, either to stay with French Cameroon or get their own country, their own government. And then, just as a sample, then the condition is after the vote, we will then sit down knowing where the people want to go, like in Namibia, and draw an agreement.
Yeah, that's why, Namibia was a unique case. The United Nations was heavily involved, and there was an institution in Lusaka, Zambia, that was actually training the Namibian government in advance. So when independence came, you could transfer the whole government from Lusaka to Namibia. In the case of Ambazonia, it would depend on how the pre-negotiations went, what the terms of the negotiations would be, and how the implementation would go. That's why it would be very, very important, and I keep coming back to this, that the Southern Cameroonian community absolutely agrees ahead of time what they would like to see from the pre-referendum negotiations, because the more terms that are agreed ahead of time, the less problems there will be after the referendum.
With your experience serving as a diplomat, you've been to lots of places, witnessed quite a handful of international peace agreements. We have a situation where they call it the state actors, in this case referring to La République du Cameroun, just doesn't want to negotiate. What does it take international actors? Because we're talking here of the Swiss process, which they walked away from. They have now said they did not consult with anybody to speak on their behalf in Canada, which means at the moment there is no prospect of negotiation, mediation, peace on the table. They just believe they're going to kill till everybody surrender. With your experience, sir, what does it take people at the international community to say, enough harm has been done, it's being done, let's stop this guy?
What it takes, Chris, is to have the community show up with one voice and one document, and in London and Paris and Geneva and Berlin and Brussels and Washington and Ottawa and at the United Nations, present a document and say, this is why we want a referendum, this is how we want to do it, and these are the terms, and these are the conclusions, and if the vote goes a certain way, this is the implementation plan. So put pressure on the government in Yaoundé to sit down with us so that we can negotiate this outcome. And of course, meanwhile, as you said, ground zero, what you talked about just before we started our discussion.
Boycott.
Yeah. There's pressure going on from the ground. So at some point, the government in Yaoundé says these people are so much of a pain. We need to sit down with them and have an honest conversation. But it has to be a conversation where the people that they are speaking to also speak with one voice. Because Yaoundé, when they speak, they are united. Even we know behind the scenes that they're not, because we know that even within Bia's government, there's different voices and different thoughts. But when they come to a meeting, they speak with one voice. The Southern Cameroonian community has to also speak with one voice, or the cause is lost before it even begins.
But the average activist here in the Southern Cameroons will tell you they have knocked almost every door, including those of the United Nations, the United States, the State Department, the House of Lords, House of Commons, the UK government, the Commonwealth. Apparently, it appears as if nobody pays attention. Now, you see the war in Ukraine going on, for example. Everybody's attention, the same people, their attention is there. Few days ago, it was Sudan, and every attention was paid there. But this war has been going on in Ambazonia, going to 7 years. We have knocked doors. It doesn't appear like nobody wants to listen. I should give credit to the Congress for the different resolutions they have produced, but they didn't go far enough to get Cameroon to realize that it's a humanitarian catastrophe and the world is seeing.
Yeah, the reason it's not that no one wants to listen. The problem is people don't know who to listen to. When you're dealing with Ukraine, you're dealing with President Zelensky. If you're dealing with Sudan, you're dealing with General Burhan and General Hamedi. With Cameroon, as I think I have told you many times before, when I was assistant secretary, I had different delegations show up, each of them saying that they were the ones who represented Southern Cameroon. If you look on the internet and you look up Ambazonia, how many websites do you end up with? That's why I keep getting back to the simple point of unity, 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 because you will find people listening if the community speaks with one voice. Believe me, people in Yaoundé would pay attention if the community spoke with one voice. But as long as they can get away with the divide and rule concept, that's what they're going to do.
What if the overwhelming majority? Because I don't think we expect everybody to be speaking in one voice. It has never happened in any struggle. But what where the overwhelming majority are speaking with one voice? Take the referendum, for example. I bet you go on the ground and in the diaspora, people who have walked away and from this struggle, they came back a few weeks ago and said, this referendum idea is what will save us. Let's pursue it. So what about a situation where the overwhelming majority see the need for one message in a referendum? Doesn't that matter to the international community then?
It will absolutely matter to the international community depending on how you present that overwhelming majority. Because if you still have, voices who say that they represent Ambazonia, coming up with a different narrative or a different mechanism, then you're going to get back to the same situation you had before with the people in the State Department saying, oh my gosh, which delegation is coming now? Or the people in the Congress who are very much united, like, I am, about an outcome that provides for the human rights and dignity of the Southern Cameroonian people, are going to say, oh my gosh, how many delegations are we going to listen to? So, I get back to my broken record, unity, unity, unity. The more people who can sign on to the same mechanism, the better.
You have been dealing with quite a number of Ambazonian groups ever since you were under Secretary of State for Africa. And in your opinion, what is the problem between the groups? I know I am an insider, of course, you know that, but from an outsider perspective, what do you see to be the problem?
Well, I get back to the point. The problem is that you have different groups showing up to the same offices, making different points. Whereas if you had maybe an umbrella organization for the referendum, and that would be the one that would speak for the majority, like I said, with one set of talking points on one document regarding the mechanism for a proposed referendum, then I think you could get a lot more people, to listen. And I have also said before, practically speaking, and you know this in Washington, how the United States and Washington works, the community would need a lobbyist. That's how other causes are going forward. I had the privilege this past weekend of attending the National Day commemoration for Somaliland. Mm-hmm. And there's such a contrast because it is one community, one point of unity. They have a representative in Washington that promotes their cause, and there's a lot of sympathy in Washington for Somaliland, and people do listen to them.
The problem, though, with Somaliland is we quoted the example of Eritrea and South Sudan. They had reached a peace agreement. The Eritreans had reached a peace agreement with Ethiopia, and the Sudanese one with South Sudan. In the case of Somaliland, they have essentially a country of their own. Why can't then the powers that be say, Somaliland, let's try a referendum so that we can formally get them cut off from Somalia? Why in their case this is not happening?
I
Because
believe that
if you're talking about unity, speaking with one voice, Somaliland is a great example.
yeah, Somaliland is a great example, and I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe that they've had a referendum. Their big problem, of course, is Somalia itself and the African Union. But again, I'm a true optimist with them because they are making forward steps all the time. They have what amounts to diplomatic relations with Taiwan. They have a number of other countries represented in Hargeisa. They don't call them embassies yet, but I have no doubt that they will get to the point where they will have their full international recognition because they're proving every day how an effective country, operates. But the key again is that there's a lot of sympathy in Washington for Somaliland because of the unity, because of the way they present themselves. So the narrative really matters.
Well, we hope that we will get there, and we are doing our best to make sure that we can get there, and we hope that the referendum route will get us speaking with one voice, one message, one people. Ambassador, so grateful for your continuous encouragement to us. Please remain strong, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
You do as well, and remember, never forget, justice is on your side.
Thank you. Thank you. That is well understood.
God bless you.
Thank you, sir.